So, Stephen, what an incredible lecture. Thank you. Lots of interesting ideas and thoughts have been provoked with your insights into William's work. And I think it's important also to just say that Stephen is a professor of literature, specializing in Nadine Gordimer in particular. But when he wrote the exhibition catalogue, the text of which has been translated into Chinese, he hasn't, I don't think, previously ever written on art or artists. So it was quite a steep challenge, I think, but it turns out to be quite an extraordinary and interesting series of kind of thoughts on William, which, in fact, because they don't come from an art historian or curator, I think are even more interesting than most other texts. In fact, virtually all other texts I've read on William. But I wanted to start, if I may, just by asking a little bit about your schooling. You were, I think, a year ahead of William or 2 years ahead of William at the same school, 1 year ahead. All boys, all white, quite sporting school, possibly and probably not the environment that William would have flourished in naturally. He's not a particularly sporting type. But you, when we were speaking before, you mentioned that there was one particular teacher that was very inspirational for a lot of the boys at the school.
Yeah, it was an interesting school. As Adrian has said, all boys, all white. And if you think of it in that way, it was doubly segregated by race and by gender. So I think it was fashioned on the English public school idea. It was, in England, a public school is actually a private school. So ours was not a private school. But the idea was that it was molding, young men to become sort of officialdom, to take their place in society and so on. And sport was one way that happened. William did flourish in his own way. He didn't do it through sport. He did it through things like theatre and debating and so on. So he was well known for that. But I might be projecting a little bit. There was a teacher who, interestingly, given what I discussed in the lecture, was our Latin teacher. So you would normally think of Latin teachers being the most staid of individuals, someone who's interested only in teaching you Latin grammar and so on. But this teacher was not like that. He taught us all about Greek culture as much as Roman culture. He got us to think for ourselves. He was really interested in our ideas. And I think William got his classical input from his family, from his grandfather and his father, but I think also this teacher had something to do with it. So when I see a film like The Sibyl, I really, I do think of that environment in a way. And there are lots of things I could say about this teacher. The work that he produced, which made us think about our own place in that society in South Africa. When I was in my final year, the final year class would always put on a play, and our play was Antigone, Sophocles' Antigone, which is about the distinction or the difference or the conflict between the laws of God and the laws of man. And which are you going to follow? Are you going to obey the laws of the king just because the king is the king? Or you're going to do what's right? Antigone does. She's quite resolute and inflexible in her own way. But that's the conflict. Anyway, that was the play that we put on. And, it introduced us to a different kind of world, I think.
Mm. And you can see that throughout William's work, I think, that kind of thorough engagement with and response to the classical teachings, if you want, and also his unending appetite for knowledge. And William is incredibly erudite. He's incredibly well read. He loves films. loves music.
He knows his opera.
He knows his, yeah, I mean, so he draws on so many different kind of areas in his work, which I think becomes quite self-evident. But I really like the idea of talking about space, and there's quite a few questions I have about the sense of space, because William's work is exactly, not only coming out of the gaps, but there's also a number of gaps that he leaves for others to fill as well. And I think it'd be interesting to hear what your thoughts are on that, because William is a very collaborative artist and works with lots and lots of different people and has worked with many of those people over very long periods of time. And so there is a kind of almost organic space that he leaves for them.
He does. I was conscious in writing this lecture that I could give the impression that William does it all on his own, which he doesn't. I hope it came through that he's working with other people all the time. And he really wants to hear from them. And I was fortunate enough to be staying with him and his wife in Johannesburg not so long ago, in February and March, actually March of this year, and visited the studio. And there you see the energy that people produce. And he was working on a new film, which will emerge quite soon, I think, called The Great Yes, The Great No, which is about a series of refugees sailing from Marseille to Martinique, and the approach to the Second World War, including figures such as Aimé Césaire and Frantz Fanon, and so on. And that's the other thing. I mean, as much as he knows the classical tradition, he's really interested in the post-colonial tradition.
Yeah.
And African history and so on, and the whole sort of African diasporic tradition as well. But so people were working on it, and they were working on it together. And everybody's involved in editing, visual editing, but editing the text as well. And, it doesn't sound too self-regarding of me. William wrote me in as well. Suddenly I was editing that text, not just copy editing this word or the grammar's wrong here, but, what about the ideas and so on. And he really wants to hear from people and for them to contribute what they have. And he'll make his own decisions. He'll make final decisions. But he really wants people to contribute. And so from low to high, people who are new there or people who've been there a long time, everybody makes a contribution. And one thing I feel is worth mentioning in particular are the musicians that he works with. I think music is such an important part of his work. And especially this current group of musicians that he works with, the composer Nhlanhla Mahlangu, who did the music for Sybil and performs as well. It's quite extraordinary. And in terms of leaving space, I think he really leaves space for his viewers as well. He wants us to enter into that space. He gives us everything he can, but he wants us to fill in those gaps in our own way. It's not predetermined. It's not preset.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And he's constantly looking, isn't he, for other collaborators, other people to work with. I mean, he's one thing about William, I think, is he's intensely loyal, and he's worked with as I've said, people for a very long time. But that doesn't mean to say that he only works with those people. He's casting his net wide all the time, looking for other people to work with, and some of that comes about through the Centre for the Less Good Idea that Stephen mentioned, which is really a kind of performance workshop in many ways, in which he provides space for people to come and harness their ideas and to work together to produce every 6 months a sequence of performances across the campus of the centre. But I also think that William, you talked about him at school and school plays, and also when he was at Wits University, that he was one of the co-founders of the Junction Theatre. There was a moment in his life where he decided that his future lay in acting, and he decided that what he needed to do was to study how to become an actor, and moved to Paris, in fact, to pursue that aim. And having been at the school for a short period of time, he realized that it wasn't actually for him, and he calls himself a failed actor. But there is something about the actor, and well, we've seen it in the welcoming speech that he filmed for you here in Taipei. But it also got me thinking about that process where we see him drawing. You showed that film of him in the studio drawing on the wall. There's something about that blank sheet of paper, which is also like a stage. And he's constantly playing with and moving between and looking at the stage from different angles.
Yeah, I think performance is part of everything he does. You can think of his drawings as a form of theatre in which, one character will change, become another kind of character, will be in dialogue with the world around it, him, her, whichever. I think he says he's a failed actor, but I think he's actually a pretty good actor. I think he's, as you can see, even in the film today, he's very good. I mean, the staging of being William over here and William over there, William doing the calligraphy there and William doing the speech over here. And sometimes it's William looking over the shoulder of another William who's thinking hard, and he's saying, what is he thinking? What's he going to produce? And William actually said to me in one of the interviews I did with him that the critical voice he sometimes thinks of as the voice of his father. Very interesting. But it's a kind of internalized criticism as well. And I think William, for someone who is so supremely smart and intelligent, is also really quite humble in realizing the limits of his thought and being prepared to play with those limits. And that's a kind of theatre as well. Let me speak about it from this direction and then from that direction. It's as if it's happening on a stage somewhere. And I think he feels that there's more wisdom in that, in the dialogue, than there is in imperial pronouncements of one kind or another.
Definitely, I think you're right there. But if I may take you back just a bit to those early years in South Africa, as an aspiring artist, what was it actually like living in apartheid? I mean, the world had sort of ostracized South Africa. So presumably to see art exhibitions or to come across art was really quite challenging, and there were probably very few commercial galleries, I imagine, too.
Yeah, it depended, which world you lived in. I think it wouldn't have been so rare for William. I think either his father or his grandfather would take him to the Johannesburg Art Gallery, which actually features in one of his films here called City Deep. And you can almost see a history of that art gallery in that film, which in the film, as you'll see it here, the art gallery begins to disintegrate and implode and so on. But William had, I think, a kind of art historical background. His parents, his grandparents gave him books. He looked at images. I think he became, interested in, to be honest, for someone like myself, it was a kind of unknown world. Although we did have another famous South African artist named Cecil Scottness, who lived down the road from us, and he became a friend. And so, so we knew some of that. But how to make art in that setting, or even to think of art, was, extremely difficult. And growing up in that world, you had a kind of self-consciousness. And by that, I don't just mean being shy or something like that. I mean, it's a way of being aware of yourself and your place in society and your own complicity in the state of things and your sense of responsibility and so on. And I think it's a kind of awareness. I teach in America, which I don't see in my students there. They just don't have that sharpness or that clarity about the compromises that they're involved in. Sometimes they do, but it feels a bit artificial. Growing up there, it was ever present. I mean, it was always there.
I mean, one of the things that struck me when I first went to visit William in Johannesburg, when we decided that we were going to do the exhibition with him, was I made a trip out to the Apartheid Museum, I think, which is really quite an extraordinary museum. Not a purpose-built museum, but a repurposed building, but an incredibly kind of intense story. But one of the stories that I was completely unaware of was just how young a city Johannesburg really is, and it's still, in its infancy. It's 100 and a few years old. Was founded because there was gold discovered, and is a constantly changing landscape, which is something that William captures quite a bit in his films. Is the spoil heaps that have come out of the mining industry. Well, suddenly someone will come and refine the spoil heap. So what was once a hill in your neighborhood disappears, and there's this constant sense of change. And how important do you think Johannesburg is for him? Because he's very international now. He could live anywhere he chooses, but he remains in Johannesburg. Well, why do you think that is?
I think it's where he belongs. And I think he's absolutely clear on that. He actually lives in the house that he grew up in. It was his parents' house. And there's an energy in South Africa, and in Johannesburg in particular. Johannesburg is a kind of a wild and crazy city. It's not the easiest place to live. You need tough skin, good instincts, good reflexes. You need a kind of resilience. But it provides a kind of energy that once you feel, is hard to let go of. And I think if William were to live elsewhere, he would really lose something. And I think he knows it. So that even when he does films like The Civil, or, works that involve the Soviet Union or France or wherever, he's always coming at it from a very solid foundation of where he belongs and where he lives. But, as I was trying to suggest in my talk, I think this issue of dialogue across space, the geography of the world, is really important to him as well. And he also talks about what he calls peripheral vision. What happens at the edges. I think he's really interested in what happens at the edges as much as what happens at the center. The center is sometimes the place of the quote-unquote good idea. Excuse me. Can we make the center of the less good idea? And one way that you do that is by engaging with other places. But I think he is firmly rooted in Johannesburg. It's absolutely where he belongs. And in fact, Nadine Gordimer, the writer that I first wrote about, she was very similar. Internationally renowned, she won the Nobel Prize for Literature, but firmly rooted in Johannesburg. It's where her energy came from. And I think William and she very much on a par from that point of view. Can I turn this around a bit?
Oh,
because
sure.
you've been asking me questions. I'd like to find out from you, because, it's such an exciting project to have undertaken curating the William show for the RA. It must have been quite daunting, challenging, exciting. It must have felt like a roller coaster some of the time, I imagine. Could you talk about that a bit?
Well, it was yes, it was a big challenge. I have to admit that when I was asked to curate the exhibition, I knew a little bit of William's work, but I wasn't that familiar with his entire career, and so it was quite a steep learning curve. But it was one that was made a lot easier by the fact that William and his studio and his colleagues and his collaborators, everyone was so welcoming and warm. But I did, yeah, I set out and I set myself a task of trying to figure out how I would conceive of an exhibition. And when I say, I'm conceiving of an exhibition for me, but that doesn't necessarily equate to that being an exhibition that William wants either. So there is, I think part of the process is gaining the trust of the person you're working with, and that's clearly very, very important. Especially when if you're working with a deceased artist, that's not really an issue. But if you're working with an artist who's alive, it's very challenging, not only for the curator, but also for the artist, because the artist has very strong views on what they want to show and how they want to be seen. And quite often contemporary artists will say, I don't want you to show any of my early work. It's what I'm doing now that's important. So in order to do that, I felt that I had to kind of deep dive into William's work. And like colleagues here in Taipei, I went to see various exhibitions that William had in Europe and also in South Africa, and started to formulate ideas in terms of what I thought would work for us. We have very distinctive spaces in London. They're very grand neoclassical galleries that date from 1868. So the atmosphere is really quite different from what you might consider to be a contemporary art, white wall, white cubes kind of space. So we had in a sense, we had the theatrical background, but how do you populate those different stages throughout? And so I think, one of the things I wanted to do was not repeat what other exhibitions had done. And that's not to say that those other exhibitions weren't interesting and worthwhile in their own right, but, wanted to take the opportunity maybe to show some of the works that people were less familiar with William. And also, I guess, if I'm being totally honest, I respond to the works that I like too, and that, I feel would help our audience in London to sort of understand William.
Mm. Yeah. Mm. Were there moments, surprising moments, things you discovered that you never thought you would find, or things you thought you would find that sadly you didn't? Or?
Well, I decided quite early on. I thought that the exhibition should be focused on his drawing, and that ultimately the mark that William makes, whether it's with a piece of charcoal, with a pencil, or with an ink brush, those are the starting points of everything he does. And in fact, the footage we saw of the Tiber, the procession, triumphs and laments. Those enormous cutouts, in fact, that were used not only for the washing of the walls, but also for the people carrying them in the procession. They all start out as drawings, this size. And likewise, the typewriter tree sculpture, those are, you can see the drawings. And then they become something else. They metamorphosize into something else. So for me, it felt like, we had to show people where that came from. And I started looking at the early drawings from the 1980, really from, you said, 84 to 89. And one of the challenges was actually trying to find these drawings, to find images of them, and to actually find out where they were, because there is no... and it's something I have mentioned to William, I think is really important. There is no catalogue raisonné of those drawings, and I'm not even sure William knows how many of them exist. As a younger artist, apparently he was extremely generous with his work. He would often give it to friends. He produced a lot of drawings, and then that whole sense of using those as the starting point to then lead to the animated films that started in 1989. I wanted to have as many of those drawings for the drawings for projection series as we could get. I wanted to create, and we've replicated that here, a wall which is just a kind of overwhelming visual of drawings from different films. And so we brought at least one drawing from each of the 11 films together. That's something that had never been done before as well. And tracking some of those down was really hard, because actually when you look at reproductions of those drawings in particular, a lot of them that are reproduced in books, that is, a lot of them are actually just stills from the film. So they're not actually the final drawing. So trying to find the final drawing was often quite challenging. And I think, during the pandemic, one thing that William and his studio team did was to develop a new website. And in the process of developing that website, they tracked down a lot of images of works. So actually it became, frustratingly for me, rather easy to find where things were. But that was like my kind of opening play with William. And I think he was sort of generally quite impressed with my research and the idea of that as a starting point.
It's interesting to me. I've been asked to contribute to a book which will be produced in Italy on a series of different artists, but it's going to focus on milestones, turning points in artists' lives. And excuse me, you mentioned William's decision not to become an actor. And I think in William's case, as much as I'd like to focus on the decisions that he made, positive decisions, what to do, there were key things on what not to do. And one of them would be not to become a lawyer, for example. One of them was not to work in oil paint. Another was not to become an actor. And I think the oil paint is interesting to me because I think you're quite right, Adrian. Everything begins with drawing. I'm absolutely sure that's right. And in William Slade lectures, I'm not sure how this phrase will translate into Chinese, but he said that oil paint to him, he never took to it because it felt like moving colored mayonnaise around on a canvas. And but, again, thinking that in terms of some of the themes I was trying to address today, oil paint is color. Color mediates between oppositions. It softens things. It has kind of texture in the coloration. Black and white is something else. It's got a starkness to it. It's got light and shade. You can't think of it without the light and shade in the black and white. And I think that really focuses what William is about. And I think, he's instinctively, he was not drawn to oil paint. Actually, after the RA exhibition, someone got in touch with me. Suddenly, as Adrian said, I'm a literature professor. I was getting questions about art, and someone wrote and said, we have a painting, an early painting of William's. I think I may have sent him on to you.
You sent it to me, yes.
And the question was, could we sell it? Is it worth something? And I thought, it's by William. It's going to be worth something, But you could sort of see in the painting why he didn't keep it up.
I think definitely you could see why. Yeah. I mean, it just wasn't. It didn't have that fluidity. It didn't have that energy at all.
Yeah.
So just to sort of carry on a little bit about the process of putting the exhibition together, there was conversations with William about works that he wanted to show, and also we had to adapt the spaces and our spaces to accommodate some. We wanted to have More Sweetly Play the Dance, which is a very large performance, over 5 or 6 screens. We simply didn't have a room that would accommodate it, so we had to find alternatives to that. William was very keen on showing the Sibyl, for example, and that was I was fortunate enough to go to the stage performance in Rome when it was staged for the first time. And there's something quite electrifying about his live performances. You've seen The Head and the Load, and I was lucky enough to see that as well. And the sheer scale of ambition that William has now is kind of extraordinary. I mean, he is not daunted by those challenges whatsoever. And again, all of those kind of performances start out on small pieces of paper and thinking through ideas. And he works very closely with a Belgian theatre and exhibition designer called Sabine Tennyson, who's done the exhibition here as well. And we talk about the small scale, but actually Sabine works in a very unusual way in that she creates scaled models, but actually quite small scale models of the spaces in which the exhibition will inhabit, and then creates even smaller representations of the different works. And again, it's that whole notion of filling space. She creates a space which is then occupied, and then, we play around with the space. William plays around with the space, and that's how they seem to work together most effectively.
Yeah, yeah. In his film, Oh, to Believe in Another World, when you see the film, it looks large scale, but it was actually done in a kind of minute little theatre, which may have been partly constructed by Sabine. I'm not sure.
Yes, it was. Yes,
yeah.
Yeah, and then William exaggerates scale as well when he does his productions, his live productions, and of course he's very hands-on with those as well, and oversees every tiny detail, and reviews and rehearses again and again with his performers and collaborators. But the exciting thing about working with William is just exactly that he's so open. He leaves space for you to occupy, and he's incredibly generous as well. So, I mean, you were saying that you stayed at his house. He has the house that he lives in, as you say, was his parents' house. His parents moved to England and they sold that property, and he was able to buy it back, I believe, and then built his drawing studio, the images of which you've been seeing. Well, this is his drawing studio here. In the garden, so he has a very short commute from his front door to the studio. But every day at 1:00, everyone stops to break bread, and they all come together. William sits at the head of the table. Anyone who's visiting, everyone who's working there, are invited to pause and have lunch. And again, it's that kind. It allows us a different kind of space, doesn't it? A release in some ways.
It was interesting to me to see, because yes, we were at those lunches, and you've got people who work in the studio, and then one day somebody is visiting from the Metropolitan Museum in New York, and they're there at lunch as well. One of the usual rules at those lunches is that nobody discusses work, and it creates, there's an amazing spirit in William's studio. People would arrive at 9:00 in the morning to go to work. 5:00, it's home time. They don't want to leave. They actually like being there, and I think that really speaks well for the person who's in charge of it all, to create that spirit. And William, look, he's world famous, he's stratospheric and so on. I've known him for a long time. We were at school together, at university together. He's the same person now as he was then. He's not full of himself. He's not grand. He's not high and mighty. None of that. He's really interested in people. He's interested in what they think. He has his own views on things, but he's really down to earth. It's quite extraordinary, I think.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, everyone loved working with him. And his studio team, and I'm sure you had the same experience here, that kind of engagement. But it is quite extraordinary how much in demand he is and how much of himself he gives to people. Unfortunately, because of Venice and clashing dates, he wasn't able to come to Taipei, but I'm sure he will come at some point. He's been keeping abreast of the exhibition, how it's developing, and is very happy with what he's seen, and so he should be, because it looks fantastic here. And although the building is very different, the spirit of the exhibition is the same. And that sense of what we tried to do with the exhibition, which was to navigate. I mean, it is really hard trying to navigate 40 years of someone's career. You have to make difficult choices about what you can bring in and things that you have to leave out. But also, was very keen to make sure that the people can see the connections that William has in his work. So over, 40 years of work, you'll see reoccurring images. The coffee pot is a very particular favorite one. You see the cat, you see the typewriter. He's very much into the old analog kind of technology. So the old dial telephones with the Bakelite, the phones and the typewriters. These are all things that emerge in many different ways. But I think what's really fascinating is when you start the exhibition, you move through from those early drawings into the multiple drawings he did. He hasn't actually changed the technology that he uses. I mean, even with the Sibyl, it's just pages turning or being placed, and it's still photographs being run together. And in many ways, it made me think a bit. I mean, I remember speaking to William about his love of slapstick, old Hollywood silent movies with Buster Keaton and those kind of crazy animated films which are silent. Every now and again you have a kind of caption, and it seems to me that actually there's a real connection between his filmic work and those kind of early films where the gap is left because no one is actually telling you what you're looking at. You have to determine what you're looking at. Occasionally a caption will flash up, but you're mesmerized by what you're seeing on the screen.
Yeah, I think actually one other thing he loves in early film is the kind of smoke and mirrors aspect, the magic of it, how you make things happen and give the illusion, that's necessary for film. But anyway, we're having fun talking here, but I'm sure there may be questions from the audience. So if anybody does have a question.
I think we need to put these on.
好，现在我们还有一点时间可以进行观众 Q&A。如果有任何提问或意见回馈，欢迎来宾举手示意。
Good afternoon. Thank you for the fascinating talk. I have a question about the media, especially the drawing as a focus of this exhibition. For me, it looks like reduction. And in terms of reduction, I want to describe kind of feeling. It's more like in process, or it's not as a result. It's more like a communicating in kind of transition. This is related to that kind of experience when we're talking about intercultural experience, that in this exhibition, we don't need that kind of knowledge to empathize the feeling when we talk about the colonialism or the fear or the terror or anything related to that. And another question specific for Mr. Wok is, when you organize this exhibition in Taiwan, and do you think this is something you need to cooperate the local situation, or do you think because the drawing as a media that is too fundamental and it's not necessary to do so? Thank you.
So you were asking a question about the importance of drawing, the fundamental aspect of drawing?
Like more universal experience, like when we communicate the humanity, and we share the same experience, like when we experience anything in a very specific way, we don't need to translate in a very cultural standardized to understand the context.
Well, I think it's interesting, isn't it? I was talking the other day about charcoal, for example, and charcoal being this really ancient form of making marks, and possibly among the earliest marks that humankind ever made, using leftover remnants from fires, for example, as well as earth pigments. And so there's a kind of ancient quality to it, a timeless quality to it, that it still can have its, that it can still be relevant today as it has been for millennia. But then also thinking about, you know, as children, the first thing almost that we do before we even manage to talk is to make marks with pencils, with watercolors, or whatever we're allowed to use, often on walls, which doesn't necessarily always gain much affection from parents. But there's that kind of inherent desire to express through depiction, and I think it is immediate, it is timeless, and it offers so many opportunities.
Yeah, I think there's something about what William again mentioned in his message, is that art is something that can be understood across the world, but people will do it in different ways, that there are particularities as well. And I may be taking this in a direction that you didn't really intend. But again, it has to do with this question almost of collage, that the meanings that we make out of it become a collage from different directions. And that we don't have to give up or surrender those directions. You know, if you're viewing William's art here in Taipei, with whatever background you come from and the associations you bring to it, that helps create the work of art. The work of art is never complete in and of itself. It needs viewers to engage with it and help make the meaning. And even if the meaning is a kind of puzzlement, what does this work mean? What is its relevance? Something very important is happening there because there's communication taking place, I think. So, not sure if that was your question, but that's the thought that I have. Thank you.
But it makes you think also with drawings for projection, what is the final work? Is it the individual drawing? Is it the film? Is it somewhere in between? I think there was a question.
谢谢。I'll just speak in Mandarin. 就是很高兴你提及到他是一个很温暖的人，然后跟人的 connection is really good, and also the conversation 就是那些对话。所以我一直就是以一个台湾人，然后我从蛮久以前就认识他的作品，因为有学习动画。但是当时以一个台湾人知道他是一个 activist， 然后又做这样子的议题，蛮强烈的议题。我蛮想知道他的以前的作品到现在的作品，如何有没有很多的对话是跟比如说 South African 就是黑人裔的 South Africans 的对话，我很想知道像这样的对话有没有很多。
Thanks. That's a very interesting question. I think that William's work has been very powerful in South Africa. The kinds of images that he made were so original when he began making them, and suddenly there was a new style of charcoal, and you know the kinds of representations that William did. And I think in some ways it was hard to get out of his shadow for other artists to have their own styles. But I think partly this question of William's reception by African artists and viewers is negotiated through his active engagement with supporting other artists, you know, so that this, at the Center for the Less Good Idea, it's an open environment where people can come and offer what they have. And I think in his own way, William very quietly helps support other, you know, art activities in communities or wherever it might be. That's just my impression. I have no absolute facts on that. So I think that I don't think anybody, you know, in South Africa, it's always a tendency to ask who's being recognized. Is it only white artists that are being recognized? Is it only white writers that are being recognized? You know, who gets the attention? Who gets the global attention? I don't think anybody resents William. I don't think they resent his success. I think he's virtually universally admired, not only because people recognize the quality of his work and the energy and the vitality of it, but also his generosity, his engagement, the way that he'll work with black performers and black musicians and so on, and does it in an honest way. He's not patronizing, he's not controlling, but he is the artist, so there are things that he wants, and he's found a way of working across racial boundaries in which people feel they have a voice, they have a place. And so I think he's pretty well respected. That's my impression.
I'll just also add that he's been quite vocal about the lack of government support for the arts in Africa, South Africa, economic situation being what it is. It's been a sector that's been very badly affected. So he talks about how private initiative is needed to create those spaces for younger performers and artists. And, so I think, he diverts money into supporting that initiative, but I think he also recognizes that he's in a position that allows him to do that and is very keen to use his position to help others.
先谢谢两位学者的一个分享，然后我想要了解的是说，因为他在作品里面有非常多的类比的老物件作为一些符号，比方说猫啊、打字机啊，或者是说转盘电话等等，那其实都是他作品里面蛮经典的一些元素。那我想知道说，随着这个时间的推移，或者是他频繁的在跟不同的来自世界各地的一些不同的伙伴来合作，或者是共事的讨论的过程当中，有没有一些新的符号出现在他的作品里面？
Actually, I think in some ways he's sort of delving even deeper into kind of ancient technology or older technology. He was working on Pepper's Ghost, which was a very basic Victorian way of creating illusions on stage so that you could create, through use of mirrors, the illusion that someone's actually acting or doing some activity on stage when they're not there at all, they're somewhere else. I think that those kind of technologies, they remind him, as with the use of the books and the pages that he takes from old ledgers and things, there's a sort of memory of the old colonial systems of control through words, through papers, through phones, through technology that was not widely available to other people. And there's also, I think, for William, that the notion of the sound that they produce as well, the distinctive sound of a typewriter or an old analog phone ringing, they're kind of buried in his memory somehow.
I think with all his performances, younger people are coming in, but they take on those same roles. They've got the megaphones, they've got the cutouts, there are coffee pots, there are all kinds of things, so I think a whole new generation is being introduced to these symbols. They are, I think William thinks of them as his dramatis persona, these these icons. These are the characters in his performances who just keep on recurring. And they'll always be there. So I think he's not going to change that. And even his drawings for projection, he calls it Stone Age filmmaking. Stone Age filmmaking. And I think he really quite likes the kind of belatedness of what he's doing, and drawing on these old technologies. And it's interesting that in dealing with the colonial apparatus that was in place, he's not dealing with the present directly, but he's dealing with its legacy in all our lives. And I think the legacy of all these objects is somehow buried in the world we inhabit, even if you're growing up in a world where all you've ever used is a screen. We still call that thing a phone, and people don't really use it to phone, or they'll talk about dialing. Nobody knows what dialing means. It used to be a rotary dial. The thing that was literal becomes a metaphor. But how do these metaphors still resonate in our lives? I think that's part of the implication of what he's doing.
好，我们开放最后一个问题哦，还有没有观众要提问？
我先问3个问题，就是，我想请问对，就是William 他的作品，就是我蛮好奇说，他描绘的族群是白人跟黑人，那黑人我不知道，就是他们在这些年来，然后他们在看他的作品的反应是什么，然后以及从过去，然后这么多年，然后到现在，他这个黑人在看他们作品，他们的想法，他们的 feedback 是什么？然后第二个问题是，我蛮好奇说，你们会就是有没有就是很受这个 William 影响的艺术家？然后，第3个问题是，因为我觉得他的那个，工作室非常吸引人。然后有没有，有什么机会可以到他工作室，可以跟他一起工作？
I'll take the third question first. Sadly, no. I think there are many requests that he gets. Can I come and work in your studio? And that avenue is generally closed. But there are some people who do. You never know. It's worth a try. And on the first question, I don't mean to contradict you, but he doesn't only depict white characters. In fact, his work is peopled with black characters as well, and they play a very important part in his drawings and in his films. And being politicized in the way that he was early on, he would have been very aware not only of the need to represent black South Africans, but also of the politics of representation, how you do that. And so early on in his works, you'll see the oppressed, the eternal oppressed, who will be involved in processions of one kind or another, or just finding their way to survive from one day to the next, or answering back, or just there'll be a look. I mean, one of the most interesting moments in the film City Deep is when Soho, who is the white character, has this moment of eye contact with a black miner who's chipping away at the surface of the earth, just trying to make a living, and there's this moment of eye contact, and what that says is basically, I see who you are. And I'm free associating here. In Zulu, isiZulu, the black South African language, the greeting, Sawubona, means I see you. I see you. And it's always struck me as a wonderful form of greeting because it's a way of saying, I see you as a human being in front of me. But I'm not sure William meant it this way. This is me bringing my associations. But there's something about the way that this black figure sees the white person. I see you. I see who you are. There's a black figure, not through anything voiced, but it is speaking back to the white person. So I think that there's always this interplay between white and black characters. And of course, William has many black collaborators that he works with all the time. So it's a good question, but I think, he's found a way, or maybe not a way of solving that, but a way of engaging with that question in all his work. So I'm not sure if you have a different view, Adrian, and I forget what the second question was. I did 3 and 1, but I can't remember 2.
I can't remember 2 either, but I would agree with you, Stephen. Yeah, I think that those early drawings, there are allusions, and they're very critical of white individuals that you see in the bohemian restaurants and overindulging environments. But increasingly, you see the figure of the black person as present, and of course, as the oppressed, as the homeless individuals struggling for survival. But that's, I think, the whole project of Drawings for Projection is to bring that critique of the white treatment of blacks into the foreground, and by demonstrating the kind of poverty and brutality of that regime is part of that process.
好，今天的活动已经到了尾声了。 请各位来宾再次以热烈的掌声，感谢两位讲者带来非常精彩丰富的演讲与对谈。